Tony Bennett almost gave up, until Frank Sinatra did it backstage. Few voices in American music carried the weight of an entire era quite like Tony Bennett. Born to Italian immigrant parents in New York City, Bennett rose from poverty and wartime service to become one of the most respected singers in the history of popular music. While the world remembers him for timeless classics like I Left My Heart in San Francisco, few truly know the challenges, quiet battles, and defining moments that shaped his extraordinary career. From smoky jazz clubs to the world's greatest stages, Tony Bennett's story is not just about fame, it is about resilience, dignity, and a voice that refused to fade with time. This is the true story behind the legend, a journey of talent, struggle, and timeless grace. The winter of 1949 arrived cold and unforgiving in Astoria, Queens. Anthony Dominic Benedetto stood outside the Paramount Theatre on a Tuesday afternoon, watching his breath dissolve into the grey November air. Inside his worn jacket pocket, he clutched a crumpled piece of paper, an address for yet another audition, this one at a small recording studio in Midtown Manhattan. At 23 years old, Tony had already lived several lifetimes. The son of immigrants who watched his father die when he was just 10, a soldier who'd witnessed the liberation of a concentration camp in Germany, and now a struggling singer trying to make sense of a dream that seemed to slip further away with each passing week. The streets of post-war New York hummed with a peculiar energy, equal parts hope and desperation. Veterans returned home expecting opportunity, only to find themselves competing for the same cramped apartments, the same low-paying jobs, the same chance at something more than survival. Tony worked as a singing waiter at an Italian restaurant in the Bronx, performed at small clubs for $20 a night when he was lucky, and spent his days knocking on doors that rarely opened. His mother, Anna, kept the family together through sheer will. She sewed in a garment factory, her fingers raw from endless hours bent over a machine, and never once suggested that Tony abandon his music. But he could see the worry in her eyes when the rent came due, could feel the weight of being the oldest son in a household that needed more than melodies to survive. His younger siblings looked up to him, and some nights, lying awake in the bedroom he shared with his brother, Tony wondered if he was being selfish, chasing something as intangible as a singing career when practical work was everywhere. The audition that afternoon went like most others. A bored pianist played half-heartedly while Tony sang Boulevard of Broken Dreams, pouring everything he had into the lyrics. The man behind the desk, a record executive whose name Tony would forget within hours, barely looked up from his paperwork. "You got a nice voice, kid, but nice doesn't sell records. Come back when you got something different." The door closed behind Tony with a soft click that felt like a verdict. He walked back to Queens, through the fading light, past storefronts decorated for the holidays, past families hurrying home to warm dinners and laughter. The city felt enormous and indifferent, a place where dreams came to die as often as they were born. By the time Tony reached his mother's apartment, he'd made a decision. Maybe it was time to be realistic. Maybe he'd given it enough tries. Maybe he could find work at the docks, or learn a trade, or do what everyone else seemed to do, except that some doors weren't meant to open. But something happened the next evening that changed the trajectory of his entire life, though he wouldn't understand it for years. Tony was performing at a small club in Greenwich Village called the Spotlight, a narrow room that smelled of cigarette smoke and spilled bourbon. The crowd numbered maybe 30 people, most of them talking through his set. He sang anyway because that's what professionals did. You gave your best even when no one was listening. Near the back of the room, partially hidden in shadow, sat a man in an expensive suit and fedora. Tony didn't notice him at first, focused as he was on hitting the emotional center of "I'll Be Seeing You." When his set ended to scattered applause, the man approached. He was young, maybe in his early 30s, with sharp blue eyes and an easy confidence that marked him as someone who belonged to a different world than Tony's. "You got something real, kid," he said, extending his hand. "Name's Bob Webster. I manage some acts, scout talent for Columbia Records. You interested in making a demo? Tony's heart hammered against his ribs. Columbia Records. That was the major leagues, the place where real careers began. Yes, sir, absolutely. Here's the thing, Bob continued, lowering his voice. The industry's changing fast. Jazz singers like you, there's not much market for it anymore. Rock and roll's coming. Rhythm and blues is hot. Novelty songs sell. If you want to make it, you gotta be willing to adapt. Sing what sells, not what you love. Can you do that? The question hung in the smoky air between them. Tony thought about his mother's tired hands, about his siblings who needed shoes and school supplies, about the stack of rejection letters growing in his desk drawer. He thought about the apartment they lived in, with its leaking faucet and paper-thin walls, and how one good record deal could change everything. I can adapt, Tony heard himself say, though something inside him twisted uncomfortably. Over the next several months, Tony recorded a handful of singles for Columbia under Bob Webster's guidance. They weren't jazz standards, or the songs from the Great American Songbook that made his heart soar. They were novelty numbers, with forced rhymes and manufactured cheerfulness, the kind of music that chased trends instead of creating them. The Hucklebuck became a minor hit, enough to get Tony some radio play and bookings at larger venues. Money started coming in, not a fortune, but enough to help his family, enough to feel like maybe he'd made the right choice. But something felt wrong. When Tony sang those novelty songs, he felt like a fraud, like he was betraying something essential about himself. The audiences clapped, the checks cleared, but the music didn't move him. It didn't move anyone, not really. It was background noise, disposable entertainment that would be forgotten as soon as the next trend arrived. By the spring of 1950, Tony found himself at a crossroads. Bob Webster wanted him to lean even further into commercial pop, to abandon the jazz phrasing and emotional authenticity that Tony considered the foundation of his artistry. Look, Tony, Bob said during a tense meeting at a diner near Times Square, you can be a starving artist singing to empty rooms, or you can be a successful entertainer. Your choice. But Columbia's losing patience. They want hits, not art projects. Tony walked out of that meeting feeling like he was drowning. He'd compromised once, then twice, then so many times he'd lost count. And for what? To sing songs that meant nothing to him, to become just another voice on the radio, indistinguishable from 100 others. He thought about the concentration camp he'd helped liberate in Germany, the unimaginable horror, the reminder of what happened when people surrendered their humanity for convenience or survival. Music wasn't life or death, he knew that, but integrity was, and he was losing his one recording session at a time. That night, Tony sat in his small bedroom and wrote a letter to Bob Webster, resigning from their professional relationship. He couldn't do it anymore, couldn't sing music that made him feel hollow, couldn't pretend to be someone he wasn't. If that meant returning to small clubs and $20 nights, so be it. At least he'd be able to look at himself in the mirror. But before he could mail the letter, the phone rang. It was Bob, his voice strained with a mixture of frustration and something that might have been respect. I got you a spot at the Paramount next week. You're opening for Pearl Bailey. It's a big stage, Tony, real big. But here's the deal. You got to do it my way. The novelty numbers, the crowd pleasers. This could be your last shot with Columbia. Don't blow it. Tony agreed, though his stomach churned with dread. One more time, he told himself. One more compromise, and then he'd figure out what came next. The Paramount Theatre was everything Tony had dreamed about as a kid. Elegant, historic, the kind of place where legends were made. Backstage, the atmosphere crackled with nervous energy. Pearl Bailey was warm and encouraging, telling Tony to relax and trust his voice. But as the minutes ticked down to his performance, Tony felt himself unraveling. He'd built his career on compromises, and now he was about to step onto one of the most prestigious stages in New York to sing songs that felt like lies. He was pacing in the narrow corridor behind the stage, trying to steady his breathing, when he noticed a man watching him from the shadows. The man was older, maybe in his mid-30s, wearing an impeccably tailored suit and holding a cigarette with practiced ease. There was something familiar about him, though Tony couldn't quite place it. The man stepped forward, and Tony's heart nearly stopped. It was Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra wasn't supposed to be at the Paramount that night. He was in the middle of what many considered a career freefall. His film contract with MGM had been dropped, his record sales were declining, and the Bobby Soxer hysteria that had defined his early fame had given way to indifference from a younger generation chasing different sounds. Yet here he stood, backstage at a Pearl Bailey show, studying Tony Bennett with an intensity that made the younger singer's palms sweat. "You're the kid from Astoria," Frank said, his voice carrying that distinctive phrasing that had revolutionized American singing. "It wasn't a question. I caught your set at the Spotlight a few months back. You were singing 'I'll Be Seeing You.' You made an old tune sound new again. That's not easy to do." Tony managed a nod, his throat suddenly dry. Frank Sinatra had heard him sing. Frank Sinatra remembered him. The reality of the moment felt surreal, like something from a dream he might wake from at any second. "What are you doing here tonight?" Frank asked, flicking ash from his cigarette. "This gig with Pearl, what's your set list look like?" Tony pulled the crumpled paper from his pocket, the list of novelty songs Bob Webster had insisted on. His hands shook slightly as he handed it over. Frank scanned the titles, and something flickered across his face. Disappointment, maybe, or recognition of a path he himself had navigated. "This what you want to be singing?" Frank asked quietly. The question cut through every rationalization Tony had constructed over the past year. In the presence of someone who understood the weight of artistic compromise, who'd faced his own battles with record executives and changing tastes, Tony found he couldn't lie. "No," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's what sells. It's what keeps me working. I got family depending on me and you think selling yourself out is gonna build something lasting?" Frank interrupted, but there was no anger in his tone, only a weary understanding. "Kid, I've been where you are. Hell, I'm still there some days. Industry wants to put us in boxes, tell us who we should be, what we should sing. But you know what the real tragedy is? It's not when they break you. It's when you break yourself, trying to be what they want." The corridor seemed to shrink around them, the distant sounds of the theater fading into background noise. Tony had heard stories about Sinatra, his volatile temper, his fierce loyalty to friends, his uncompromising standards when it came to music. But standing here now, Tony saw something else, a man who'd fought the same battles and carried the scars to prove it. "I can't afford to be pure," Tony said, frustration bleeding into his words. "I can't afford to sing jazz standards to empty rooms while my mother works herself to death in a factory. Maybe you can walk away from a bad deal, but You think I didn't have people depending on me?" Frank's voice sharpened. "You think I didn't have mouths to feed, bills to pay? I'm not telling you to starve for your art, kid. I'm telling you that compromise has a price, and eventually you pay it. You pay it in the middle of the night when you can't sleep because you know you're faking it. You pay it when you're 50 years old and you look back at a career full of songs that meant nothing to you. You pay it when the audience can hear the lie in your voice, even if they can't name it." A stage manager appeared at the end of the corridor, signaling that Tony had 5 minutes until his call. 5 minutes until he walked onto that stage and sang songs that felt like betrayal. 5 minutes until he took another step down a path that led away from everything that mattered to him. Frank must have sensed Tony's panic, because his expression softened. "Listen to me. You got a gift. A real gift. I don't say that lightly. Your phrasing, your tone, the way you inhabit a lyric, that's not something you learn. That's something you are. And if you bury it under novelty crap because some suit tells you it's the smart move, you're not just hurting yourself. You're depriving the world of something it needs." "But how do I make it work?" Tony asked, the question that had haunted him for months finally spoken aloud. "How do I stay true to the music and still survive?" Frank took a long drag from his cigarette, and for a moment Tony saw past the legend to the man beneath, someone who'd faced rejection, who'd climbed back from professional death, who understood that success and integrity didn't always align. "You find people who believe in what you're doing," Frank said finally. "You build relationships with arrangers, with musicians, with anyone who gets that the music matters more than the money. And yeah, sometimes you take gigs that pay the bills even if they're not your dream job, but you never ever let them change who you are at your core. You hold the line on what makes you you." The stage manager called again, more insistent this time. Tony had to go. But as he turned to leave, Frank caught his arm. "One more thing," Frank said. "After tonight, I'm going to make some calls. There are people who need to hear you, the real you, not whatever package they're trying to sell. I can't promise anything will come of it, but I can promise they'll listen. Can you do me a favor, though?" "Anything," Tony said. "Forget that set list. Go out there and sing what you love. Sing a standard, something from the songbook. Sing it like your life depends on it, because in a way, it does. Your artistic life, anyway." "But Bob said—" "Bob Webster's not the one standing on that stage," Frank interrupted. "You are, and you got to decide right now what kind of singer you're going to be. The kind who sings what he's told, or the kind who sings what he means." Tony looked down at the set list in his hand, at the titles that represented safety and compromise, and a slow death of everything he valued. Then he looked at Frank Sinatra, a man who'd survived career disasters and personal crises because he'd never surrendered the essential truth of who he was. The stage manager was practically shouting now. Pearl Bailey's set had ended, and the audience was waiting. Tony folded the set list and slipped it into his pocket, then walked toward the stage entrance. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears, could feel it in his fingertips. Every rational part of his brain screamed that he was making a mistake, that he was throwing away his shot with Columbia, that Bob Webster would drop him before the night was over. But as he stepped into the wings and heard the announcer introduce him, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Tony Bennett," he made his choice. The stage lights were blinding, turning the audience into a sea of shadows and silhouettes. Tony walked to the microphone, aware of every eye on him, aware that this moment would define something essential about his future. He nodded to the pianist, a seasoned professional named Ralph Sharon, who'd been assigned to accompany him. Ralph looked confused when Tony leaned in and whispered a different song title than what was on the official set list. "Because of You," Tony said quietly, in B-flat. Ralph's eyebrows shot up. It was a romantic ballad from 1940, not remotely what Columbia wanted him singing. But Ralph was old school, a musician who understood that sometimes you had to trust the singer's instincts. He adjusted his sheet music and nodded. Tony closed his eyes for just a moment, finding the emotional center of the song. He thought about his father, gone too soon. He thought about his mother's sacrifice, the way she'd never given up on him, even when giving up would have been easier. He thought about the men he'd served with in the war, some of whom never made it home. He thought about every dream he'd almost surrendered in the name of practicality. And then he sang. The first notes came out pure and clear, his voice carrying a vulnerability and strength that silenced the restless audience immediately. This wasn't performance in the manufactured sense. This was truth, emotional honesty laid bare. Tony didn't just sing the lyrics, he lived them, pulling every ounce of feeling from the melody and delivering it with the kind of phrasing that made old songs sound like they'd been written specifically for him. Halfway through the song, Tony opened his eyes and saw the audience leaning forward in their seats, completely absorbed. He saw Pearl Bailey standing in the wings, one hand over her heart. And in the shadow stage left, he saw Frank Sinatra watching with an expression that might have been approval or relief or recognition, the look of one artist seeing another choose the harder, truer path. When the final note faded, there was a beat of pure silence. That sacred moment when an audience has been genuinely moved and needs a second to return to themselves. Then the applause started, building from scattered claps to something thunderous and sustained. Tony stood at the microphone, overwhelmed by the response, barely able to process what had just happened. He sang 3 more standards that night, each one a declaration of artistic identity. By the time he left the stage, he knew Bob Webster would be furious. He knew Columbia might drop him. He knew he'd probably just torpedoed the commercial success he'd been chasing for months. But for the first time in over a year, Tony felt like himself again. Backstage, Frank was waiting. He didn't say anything at first, just extended his hand. Tony shook it, feeling the weight of approval from someone whose opinion mattered more than any record executive's. "That took guts," Frank said simply. "Most guys don't have it in them to walk away from the safe choice. You just did it in front of 1,000 people." "I might have just ended my career," Tony admitted, the adrenaline starting to wear off and reality creeping back in. "Or you might have just started it," Frank countered. "Real career, I mean. The kind that lasts. Now, like I said, I'm going to make some calls. There's a guy named Mitch Miller at Columbia. Difficult son of a bitch, but he knows talent when he hears it. I'll make sure he catches your next show. And there's some arrangers I know, guys who could help you develop a sound that's commercially viable without being garbage. Percy Faith, for one. You interested?" Tony nodded, unable to find words adequate to express his gratitude. "One thing you need to understand," Frank continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "This business will try to break you 100 different ways. Success breaks you. Failure breaks you. Sometimes the weight of your own talent breaks you. I've been broken more times than I can count, and I'll probably get broken again. But as long as you remember why you started singing in the first place, as long as you protect that core truth, you can survive anything they throw at you." The aftermath of that night at the Paramount was exactly as brutal as Tony had anticipated. Bob Webster dropped him within 48 hours, his voice cold over the phone. "You had one job, Tony. One job. Good luck finding another manager willing to work with someone who doesn't take direction." Columbia Records sent a terse letter suggesting they were re-evaluating their relationship with Tony Bennett, industry code for "you're probably done here." For about 72 hours, it looked like Tony had made a catastrophic mistake. He moved through those days in a fog of regret and second-guessing, wondering if Frank Sinatra's advice had been the romantic idealism of someone who could afford to take risks, while Tony was just a kid from Queens who'd gambled away his only real shot. Then the phone rang. Mitch Miller, the powerful A&R man at Columbia Records, had indeed attended Tony's next performance at a small club in Manhattan. And while Miller was known for his commercial instincts and his sometimes ruthless approach to shaping artists, he'd heard something in Tony's voice that night, something authentic and rare enough to warrant a gamble. Miller didn't promise overnight success or easy money, but he offered Tony a chance to record standards his own way, with arrangements that honored the material rather than chasing trends. "Sinatra called me," Miller admitted during their first meeting. "Said you were the real thing. Frank doesn't make many calls like that, so I figured I should listen. Here's the deal, though. You do it my way in the studio, but your way means respecting the song. We're going to build something that lasts, not something that charts for 6 weeks and disappears. You in?" Tony was in. The next several years were a masterclass in patience and persistence. Tony recorded steadily for Columbia, developing a signature sound that balanced commercial appeal with artistic integrity. Songs like "Because of You" and "Cold, Cold Heart" became hits, not by abandoning jazz phrasing or emotional authenticity, but by applying those skills to material that connected with a broad audience. Tony learned to navigate the industry's demands without losing himself in the process, a balance that proved far more difficult than he'd anticipated. But the music industry was changing rapidly. By the late 1950s, rock and roll had exploded onto the scene, and traditional pop singers found themselves increasingly marginalized. Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, they represented a seismic shift in popular taste, and artists like Tony Bennett were suddenly considered old-fashioned, relics of an earlier era. Record sales declined, television appearances dried up. The momentum Tony had built seemed to be slipping away, and once again he faced the question of whether staying true to his artistic vision was a luxury he could afford. During this turbulent period, Frank Sinatra remained a quiet but consistent presence in Tony's career. There were no grand gestures or public endorsements. Frank operated through the invisible network of the music industry, making strategic introductions, recommending Tony to promoters, and occasionally inviting him to share bills at major venues. When Frank formed his own record label, Reprise, he ensured that Tony knew there would always be a place for him if Columbia finally gave up on his style of music. More importantly, Frank became a mentor in the truest sense, someone who understood the psychological toll of maintaining artistic standards in an industry built on compromise. They'd talk backstage at various shows, conversations that ranged from the technical aspects of phrasing to the deeper questions about what made a career meaningful. Frank was brutally honest about his own struggles, his battles with depression and anger, his complicated relationships with family and colleagues. He didn't present himself as someone who had all the answers, but rather as someone who'd learned through painful experience that certain principles were worth fighting for. "You're gonna have years when nobody wants what you're selling," Frank told Tony during a late-night conversation in 1959. "Years when you feel like you're shouting into a void. That's when you find out what you're made of. Any schmuck can be an artist when the world's applauding. The real artists keep going when nobody gives a damn." Tony held on to those words through the lean years of the early 1960s. He played smaller venues, accepted lower fees, watched younger artists dominate the charts with music that felt alien to him. But he never stopped singing standards, never abandoned the Great American Songbook, never betrayed the artistic identity he'd fought so hard to protect. His mother, now elderly and struggling with health issues, told him she was proud, not because of the money or the fame, but because he'd stayed true to himself. That pride meant more to Tony than any record contract. Then, in 1962, something unexpected happened. A song called "I Left My Heart in San Francisco" was brought to Tony's attention by his pianist, Ralph Sharon. The song had been written years earlier and largely forgotten, a simple ballad about nostalgia and longing. Tony recorded it almost as an afterthought, not expecting it to change anything. But the song resonated with audiences in a way that defied the conventional wisdom about what worked in popular music. It became a massive hit, won Tony his first Grammy Awards, and re-established him as a major artist. More importantly, "I Left My Heart in San Francisco" proved that there was still an audience for the kind of music Tony believed in. Music rooted in emotional truth, sophisticated arrangements, and respect for melody and lyric. It validated every difficult choice he'd made over the past decade. Every night he'd stayed the course when it would have been easier to chase trends or give up entirely. Frank Sinatra, by then chairman of the board and one of the most powerful figures in entertainment, sent a telegram. "Told you. Never doubted it for a second. FS." The success of "I Left My Heart in San Francisco" didn't solve all of Tony's problems, but it provided breathing room and momentum. He continued recording albums of standards, found new audiences through television appearances, and gradually built a reputation as one of the great interpreters of American popular song. The career arc wasn't a straight line upward. There were still setbacks, still years when his style of music fell out of fashion. But Tony had learned how to sustain himself through the valleys, how to keep working and believing, even when the culture seemed to be moving in a different direction. Through it all, Frank remained a touchstone. They performed together occasionally, their voices blending in ways that highlighted their individual artistry, while creating something larger than either of them alone. Frank's own career had its peaks and valleys, periods of enormous success alternating with professional and personal crises. But both men understood that longevity in their business required more than talent. It required an almost stubborn refusal to become something you weren't, even when that path appeared easier. By the 1990s, Tony Bennett experienced something almost unprecedented in popular music, a complete career resurgence. Younger artists who'd grown up on rock and hip-hop discovered his music and recognized its timeless quality. MTV, the epitome of youth culture, invited him to record an unplugged special, and Tony's performance introduced him to an entirely new generation. He collaborated with contemporary artists, won more Grammy Awards, and became a living symbol of artistic integrity and endurance. Frank Sinatra, watching his friend's late career renaissance, remarked to a mutual colleague, "Tony's getting the recognition he always deserved. Took the world a while to catch up to what I knew back in 1950. When Frank passed away in 1998, Tony felt the loss profoundly. They'd never been daily companions, never had the kind of friendship that involved constant contact, but Frank had been there at crucial moments, offering guidance when Tony needed it most, believing in him when belief was in short supply. At Frank's memorial, Tony sang "The Way You Look Tonight," his voice carrying decades of gratitude and respect for the man who'd helped him find his path. The years continued to roll forward. Tony kept recording, kept performing, kept honoring the music he loved. Even as he entered his 80s and then his 90s, his commitment never wavered. He collaborated with Lady Gaga on 2 albums that bridged generational divides, proving that authentic artistry transcended demographic categories. He continued painting under his birth name, Benedetto, finding in visual art another form of the expression that had always driven him. Then came the Alzheimer's diagnosis in 2016. Tony was 90 years old, and the disease that would eventually claim his faculties was beginning its cruel progression. Many assumed he would retire immediately, that performing would become impossible. But Tony, with the support of his family and his longtime pianist Lee Musica, continued to sing. Music, it turned out, lived in a different part of the brain than other memories, and Tony could still access the songs he'd spent a lifetime learning, could still find the emotional truth in melodies he'd sung thousands of times. His final performances were heartbreaking and transcendent. Tony would sometimes lose his place, would need gentle reminders about where he was or what came next. But when he sang, the essence of who he was emerged intact. The voice remained pure, the phrasing still impeccable, the emotional honesty undimmed by the disease ravaging his mind. Audiences wept, not just at the sadness of watching a legend fade, but at the proof that art could survive even when everything else was stripped away. Tony Bennett's last major public performance came in August 2021, 2 concerts at Radio City Music Hall with Lady Gaga. By then, the Alzheimer's had progressed significantly, and Tony needed extensive support to navigate the evening. But when he stepped onto that stage, when the music started and muscle memory took over, Tony was himself again. An artist doing what he was born to do, honoring the songs he'd protected his entire career. Backstage after that final show, surrounded by family and friends, Tony sat quietly, tired but content. Someone mentioned Frank Sinatra, remembered how Frank had believed in Tony from the beginning, how he'd intervened at crucial moments to keep Tony's career alive. Tony nodded, his eyes distant but clear for just a moment. "Frank told me something," Tony said softly, his words slow but deliberate. "That night at the Paramount, when I was ready to give up. I never told anyone, but I think about it all the time." His family leaned closer, wanting to catch every word, while his memory still held them. He said, "Tony, you sing like you got something to prove to God, not to the suits in the boardroom. That's why you're going to outlast all of us. That's why people will still be listening when everything else is forgotten." Tony smiled, a lifetime of choices and consequences visible in that expression. The struggles, the triumphs, the moments of doubt, and the moments of absolute certainty. "He was right," Tony whispered, "not because I was special, but because the songs were. And I never forgot that." Tony Bennett passed away on July 21, 2023, 2 weeks before his 97th birthday. He left behind a staggering legacy: 19 Grammy Awards, over 50 million records sold worldwide, and a body of work that defined American popular music for multiple generations. But perhaps more importantly, he left behind proof that artistic integrity wasn't just a romantic ideal. It was a sustainable career strategy, a foundation that could support a lifetime of work. At his memorial service, contemporary artists and legends alike paid tribute to a man who'd shown them that you didn't have to sacrifice your soul to survive in the music industry. You had to be willing to struggle, yes. You had to be prepared for lean years and closed doors. But if you held the line on what mattered, if you protected the essential truth of who you were, you could build something that lasted not just for a few hit singles, but for 70 years. And somewhere in that tribute, in the songs that were sung and the stories that were shared, echoed the voice of Frank Sinatra, the man who'd seen Tony's potential when Tony himself was ready to walk away, who'd made a few crucial phone calls that changed the trajectory of an entire career, who'd understood that sometimes the greatest gift you could give another artist was simply believing in them when belief made all the difference. The music industry had changed beyond recognition from those early days in post-war New York, but the lesson Tony Bennett embodied remained timeless. That authenticity, pursued with relentless commitment, was its own form of success. That artistic integrity wasn't incompatible with commercial viability. It was the foundation upon which real, lasting careers were built. And that sometimes the most important moment in an artist's life happened backstage, witnessed by almost no one, when a single conversation offered a glimpse of who they could become if they were brave enough to try. Tony Bennett had been brave enough, and the world was infinitely richer because of it.